Let's try and get started once again. Can you all hear me, or do you need headphones? Okay. It is a great pleasure to see you here, and it gives me great pleasure to present both panelists. To my right, Alice Munya, you will recognize her. She was a speaker at today's opening session, and she was the chair of last year's IGF in Nairobi. And to my left is David Suter, a renowned academic. We have asked him to, well, it started, I think, around the IGF last year. We, as Internet Society, thought it would be useful to start country case studies on how Internet governance is handled at the national level. Quite often the discussions are about global issues, but we know, and each IGF it comes up, that Internet governance, much of Internet governance actually takes place at the lowest level, at the national level. And we thought looking at different countries, how they deal with these issues would make sense. It would be looking at what works, what are the good practices, what works well, what works less well, what are the lessons learned, what would people do differently with hindsight. And when looking at Africa, we thought let's begin with the developing country, and then we looked at various possible countries, and we thought Kenya would be a very good example. Well, we had hoped to have the permanent secretary, Mr. Bitangendemo, up on this podium with us. Unfortunately, he could not make it to the opening session. I think he's still held up in Dubai. But I do remember when I first met him, we had lunch in Nairobi, and I had heard from Kenyan friends that he is very active in participating in local discussions on listservs with civil society, with all the stakeholders. And I did ask him the question, I hear that you are participating in listserv discussions with civil society and all the other stakeholders. This is very rare that a high-placed civil servant does that. And he said, yes, I do so. It can be painful, but it helps us make better decisions. And I thought that encapsulates very well the spirit of enlightened leadership we have in Kenya. And the Internet in Kenya has made really rapid progress in the past few years, and we hear more about that from Alice. But I don't want to hold up for too long and ask David to introduce both studies. We have the studies are up on our website, and we have a few printouts with us, but unfortunately it was not possible to print enough copies to distribute them largely here in Baku. But to those present in the room, I think we have enough to hand out. But please, David.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, firstly, I'd like to thank Marcus for commissioning these two studies on behalf of the Internet Society. I've always felt that national Internet governance is important and often underestimated in the global Internet governance discourse. At the national level matters, and it matters particularly to Internet users. And so what we tried to do here, the two reports, is to initiate a process of greater understanding and assessment of the national experience in such a way that we could learn what's working and what's not working, and also identify areas where we as the Internet Society, and in this case the Kenyan government and Internet community, can make improvements that will help for the future. So firstly, the framework report, just to outline that, it attempts to do two things. The first thing that the framework report does is try to create an approach to mapping the national Internet governance environment. And it builds that around three main areas, which I think are probably fairly obvious. But firstly, issues of Internet governance, the issues that matter to people. Secondly, stakeholders, those who are involved and those who aren't involved but are affected by the Internet. And third, the decision-making bodies or decision-making fora. None of those are actually simple. So there's a range of issues, from highly technical issues to issues of infrastructure to very broad public policy issues in which the Internet community is only one among many players. In stakeholders, there are government agencies, private companies on the supply side, and also on the demand side, that is users, civil society organizations, the internet technical community, and also often neglected present and future users of the internet. And there's a range of decision making for it too, some of which are formal and well known, things like the domain name registrar and registries, or the internet exchange point, but some of which are less obvious and less discussed, such as the telecommunications businesses themselves, the telecoms operators, which are highly powerful decision makers in the internet, in determining the internet experience of users. So this report builds on previous work I've done for APC, the Association for Progressive Communications, develops a mapping structure, parts of which look quite pretty, I think, but which is intended to help elucidate the textual analysis of a national study. Turning to Kenya, I'll leave Alice mostly to talk about Kenya, but I'll say some of the findings of the report. I think Kenya, as Marcus said, was chosen because there's a high level of internet governance involvement there, and a lot of very positive experience, particularly within the African continent, where it's been very influential. And certainly there's a much more substantial internet governance community in Kenya than in most comparable countries. It's more diverse among stakeholder communities. Its diversity has been fostered by a multi-stakeholder organization called KICTANET, by the national IGF, and also by government support, which would not have been there in many other countries. The issues that concern people in Kenya are fluid. They change year by year, so it's quite important to understand this, that internet governance understanding in a country, the environment in a country, is not a status quo. It's going to be different next year from what it was a year ago. But of particular importance in the past was access to submarine cable that was achieved in 2009-10, and the most important issue today was cybersecurity, followed by access into rural areas, or access into the areas where access was poorer. Cybersecurity was an important concern across the board. I was quite surprised by how overwhelming that was, though there was it was a very mixed understanding of what cybersecurity meant. So the term was being used, but with different interpretations. And similarly, I think that internet governance was understood as meaning different things. Some people thought it was public policy, some people thought it was very technical. Less understanding of technical issues, as you would expect, but even in the technical community, we were quite surprised at the number of, for example, ICT entrepreneurs who were not aware of IPv6. Or of specific issues like DNSSEC, so more specific technical issues. And there's clearly a capacity building question there. Domain name management was generally thought to be satisfactory. The diversity of stakeholders we look at in some detail, and there are maps doing that in the Kenya report. And as in all contexts, it's more diverse than you might expect. However, there are also significant gaps. So there are still a lot of people who are highly affected by the internet and by internet governance who are not involved in it. For example, small and medium businesses in the ICT sector had a very low level of knowledge, we found, of internet governance issues. Cyber cafe owners and managers, still an important source of access for many people, were not engaged at all in internet governance. Technical specialists actually were also patchily engaged in their own bit of the field, but not in others. And we were, again, a little bit surprised by that. Very limited engagement of civil society organizations in general. Those that are involved in development and so on were not terribly involved. So there's scope there for building on that, on the positive experience of KICTANET and the IGF so far. And there's a new ISOC chapter which will be engaged with that. Decision-making bodies I've mentioned, and perceptions of internet governance. Overall then, strong performance, one of the strongest that we'd be likely to find in Africa, and diversity, a good benchmark against which to measure other countries, and we're hoping that there will be more assessments, either from ISOC or from other organizations, who are welcome to use the framework. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that. And indeed, I always like to say good internet governance begins at home. Alice, over to you. You played a very central role in Kenyan internet governance discussions. I'm not sure whether you had time to study in detail the report, but I would be very interested if you had. What is your feedback? Do you recognize your country, your policy in the report? And also, what would be interesting for me at least, to know what would you do differently? I mean, you have reached quite a high level by African standards. What are lessons learned? Would there be some fast cuts or whatever? So please, Alice.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, David. I'm extremely pleased to be sitting here in front of all of you, to be listening to a case study that's been conducted in Kenya, because we have very many initiatives that are actually worth talking about, and we're not very good with documenting. And I think we mentioned that yesterday as part of the enhanced cooperation discussions, the importance of documenting and communicating some of the initiatives at the various levels. So this is great, and I congratulate ISOC, congratulate and thank ISOC and David and the other research team for doing this. So very, very pleased, and I hope it's a helpful tool for other countries as well in terms of organizing at the national level. Having said that, I come from a country, an African country that has become quite famous in coming up with very innovative and creative ways of dealing with our unique challenges. Our unique challenges as an African country, a developing country in Africa. And I think most of you already know our very good examples, Ushahidi, mobile money, M-Pesa initiatives to help bank the unbanked. So when we first attended the first or the second IGF, we actually did not attend the very first IGF because we were not following the WSIS process after Geneva. We had gone as far as chairing the first Internet Governance Working Group during the WSIS process in 2003, but then after that dropped off to make sure that we were working at the national level because we needed to develop an ICT policy, which we didn't have. We needed to start really working hard towards making Kenya an information economy. So what happened then is there was a gap until the second IGF that took place in Brazil. And when I attended it with colleagues of mine, we realized there were very few Africans participating. And not just at the IGF, and not just participating, but contributing meaningfully to some of these processes. And we felt, well, I think we want to make sure that we actually do something about it. So when we went back home, the first thing we did was to organize a national IGF in 2008 and make sure that it was a very bottom-up process that was developed by first having mailing list discussions at the national level and then a face-to-face discussion that brought together various stakeholders, government, private sector, and in fact even the financing of the process itself was very multi-stakeholder in nature. And then from there, we actually felt that the national IGFs would then form building blocks for the regional IGF. So we encourage other East African countries of Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, and Uganda to have the same processes at the national level. So Kenya was actually spearheaded and led those processes in the other 4 East African countries. In Kenya, what we did, we just didn't stop there. We actually felt that the impact of the multi-stakeholder model is felt more at the national level, and so we went beyond and have actually done quite a lot using that model in a number of our initiatives, including the way our fiber optic cable was developed, our Kenya Internet Exchange Point, our CCTLD at the national level is also a multi-stakeholder, back to the multi-stakeholder model. So I'm very pleased to note that the research, actually, the study itself is quite correct in a number of nearly all the instances is quite correct, including naming some of the main champions, because you really can't do this you can't really make some of these processes successful unless you have various champions and political will at the very high level. And so we are very lucky to have had an open door policy where we had a government that was quite receptive, realized that it was time for Kenya to move on to a knowledge economy, and provided that window. We had stakeholders that were very keen, an ICT sector that's extremely vibrant, private sector people that were actually quite keen to ensure that policy was being developed in a multi-stakeholder model where they could be part of. And so it was felt that the IGF was quite a good space. Of course, the only challenge was that most of the, especially the industry felt it really didn't provide enough for policy to actually be developed and to hold the government accountable. And so we decided we were not going to really be bound by the challenges of the global IGF and rather create our own model of the IGF, which is still multi-stakeholder, but try and ensure that we are doing there are a few concrete projects and initiatives coming out of there, and that's why open data soon after that, Teams and all the others, although I wouldn't attribute the IGF to all of those initiatives, but it did play a role in that. So, you know, the study is great, and it actually does provide a very good example, a good example of what's going on, and also a correct one in terms of the various stakeholders involved, the processes, and all of that, and we're very pleased to have it out here. Thank you. Yeah, I would welcome questions.
Well, thank you, Alice. That's great feedback to have from the country concerned, that you actually feel well represented by the study. And it is true, it doesn't just happen. It is hard work behind it. There are other African countries where you have undersea cables, but prices have not necessarily come down because the regulatory framework is not the right one that is in place. And in Kenya, you have shown that multi-stakeholder cooperation actually delivers. And I did attend some of the national and regional meetings, and I do remember the buzz it created once you had the cable landed in Mombasa, but then you had the policy in place to take advantage of that. So that's clearly to your credit. We have time for some questions if there are any, or David, would you like to make some additional comments? Alice, would you?
Yeah, I'd like to, I think I didn't respond to the question regarding what we would do differently. This having been the 5th IGF, and it was really, you know, the government that was trying to, that really supported it in private sector. What we will do different, and we have done, is handed it over to another stakeholder group. We've actually handed over the coordination of it to ISOC Kenya, which is yet, you know, a new body that has been created, the ISOC Kenya chapter, and we want to, so that it can bring in a new perspective, a new way of doing things, but still with the same level of support from government and the private sector. We've also done the same with the East African IGF. Of course, realizing that governments wanted more out of it, and so we felt the best way was to actually have it hosted by a regulatory authority body that would then work with the regional IGF in a different way, which already has a multi-stakeholder model in terms of developing regulatory frameworks. So that's what we'll do differently, and that's what we are doing already, in that we felt that we needed to share out the coordination of the national IGF, and we are hoping that we'll have 5 more, you know, hosted by ISOC Kenya chapter, and then after that another stakeholder group may take over and implement the same, and it continues to grow and evolve.
No, thank you. I'm doubly pleased. It's an ISOC chapter,
yes.
And also the leader of the ISOC chapter is an old friend of mine, Barak Otieno.
Yes.
If there are no questions, then there is a question. Yes.
Any results that can inform from the Kenyan study, and I have to admit that I didn't have the chance to read it all, I just flicked it through, that could inform the IGF. So did we learn anything from Kenya that we can take it and put it into the context of the IGF? And is it valuable to continue these studies because potentially they can actually create this consistent message that can be placed into this larger picture called the IGF?
David?
Well, I'm always wary of trying to translate one country's experience to other places, because every country's experience is highly determined by its own context, so its own political, economic, social, cultural context, its own infrastructure context, and so forth. I'm very wary of taking that and saying, you know, try the same thing elsewhere, because it doesn't necessarily fit into those. But I think there are some things you can see in the Kenyan experience which are valuable. And I think Alice was mentioning the role of the government as being very positive towards a kind of multi-stakeholder context. And she also mentioned the role of champions. Now, politically, I'm instinctively, you know, not keen on the idea of individuals championing things rather than things coming out of social collective action. But I think it is a reality that in most countries, individuals have been extremely important in promoting approaches to the internet and approaches to internet governance. So I think that there is a strong point in what she's saying there, and it's definitely evident in Kenya. I think it does illustrate, on the other side, I think it does illustrate the need for a kind of capacity building, two kinds of capacity building. I mean, I think it is ultimately a problem that internet governance is dealt with by people who are concerned primarily with the internet. Because as the internet becomes more and more important in society, it becomes more and more important across the whole range of public policy issues. And so it's really necessary for people whose primary concern is not the internet to be engaged in internet policy debates. And I do think there is a problem if the young ICT entrepreneurs, as we found here, are not engaged in internet governance. I think they need to be, and I think that's where the next generation of kind of fresh blood and new thinking is going to come from, those kinds of people. So I think there's an outreach issue there that's quite important, which I do see in the global IGF as well. Both of those things I think are important to the global IGF as well.
But I clearly think it interacts very well with the global IGF. If you build on national country studies, as David said, each country is different. There's no one-size-fits-all model, but nevertheless, there are interesting stories, and it is interesting to look at what worked in one country. Are there lessons we can take over? I think clearly there are lessons to be taken from your particular model to other African countries, and if they did similar things, they would greatly improve access to the internet. And as David said at the beginning, what I also learned is in Africa, usually access is the number one problem, at least to begin with, but then once the access situation has improved, then other problems come to the fore. The shift in the Kenyan debate, I think, demonstrates that very clearly. When I first came to Kenya, it was all about access. And then 2-3 years later, we discussed all the other problems. So, no, clearly, I think we hope that we will be able to finance other studies, and we hope that we find sponsors, and also other countries maybe could come forward and be interested to have a team looking at their model. But it is important, I think, the way David did it with a Kenyan partner, it is important to have a partner from within the country, not just come as an expert from Europe or the US and look at what they are doing. No, that you work together with the country, and I think the way you received it proves that this has worked well in this particular case. So if there are no other questions or comments from Alice or David, do we take it then that we conclude this press conference? Thank you very much, Alice. Thank you very much, David, and thank you for joining us.